Good evening. For those of us who are old enough to remember the Soviet Union, it seems extraordinary to be sitting here in central London interviewing two still very young journalists who have been working for 10 years running this very ambitious website, agentura.ru, and who've now produced a book which is published in the West, here and in the States. Has it been published in Russia?
Not yet, because, to be frank, when we decided to write a book, Russian publishers shown no interest to have it published in Russian, so well, we turned to American publisher, and we were happy to find Public Affairs to be ready to publish this book, to accept this manuscript.
When Putin came to power, in his very first speech, he made a very strong statement to the effect that we insist on the only possible dictatorship, a dictatorship of law. And yet Russia today seems to be much further from that state, I would say, than it was then. And you, in your book, seem very directly to be saying that that is, in a significant measure, to do with what has happened with the security services since the rise of Putin, or since the fall of communism.
Maybe it's, I have to say firstly that the revival of the FSB began not with Putin. It was one of the biggest miscalculation that was quite popular in the early 2000s. But in fact, some very crucial things happened with the FSB in the mid-1990s. For example, prisons, including Lefortovo, were returned back to the prisons. Yeah, were returned back to the FSB in 1995. And the unit responsible for political surveillance was resurrected in 1998. Well, so in this case, we might say that Putin, of course, was very helpful for the FSB, and he given the FSB new powers and the regime of immunity, and he allowed the FSB to absorb many former parts of the KGB, but the process started long before Putin became a prominent figure.
And I believe you're also very clear in the view that it wasn't the security services that put Putin into power, but that's a commonly held view in the West. That
yeah, yeah, you know that people from former officials of the KGB were very happy to pronounce in the early 2000s that we are back to power. It's a revival of the KGB. And we can present to Russia a new idea and to save the country. But in fact, we can say today that FSB never tried to gain power. They were given the powers by the ruling class that we had in the 1990s, and we still have the same people in 2000s. And these rich and ambitious people and state bureaucracy just decided maybe in 1998, after the financial crisis in Russia, because it was a big problem, at the same time the middle classes became very disillusioned with the Western model of democracy and capitalism. But it would be more efficient and more effective to have more authoritarian model in Russia than it used to be in the early or more authoritarian model in Russia than it used to be in the early or mid-1990s.
But we should say that the FSB as a new Russian elite has failed because they couldn't suggest any new idea for Russia's future and for
the present.
And for the present, yes.
The obvious question, looking at your book, is about the title of the book, where that comes from.
Well, it was this term, we can say, was coined by then FSB director Nikolai Patrushev, who in December 20th, 1999, celebrating the anniversary of Czech-Russian Soviet secret police said that FSB personnel today is a kind of new nobility of Russia.
Yeah, it's a scary phrase. It's very clear to us in the West that the great challenge that faced the FSB and Russia during Putin's first decade was terrorist attacks from North Caucasus. And yet, on this front, your book points out that the FSB and indeed the whole security services absolutely lamentably failed to deal with these crises. I would like you to talk a little bit about the reasons why.
Well, first of all, because the FSB became too close to the Kremlin. The Kremlin decided, I think it was a kind of common decision, not to criticize the FSB for mistakes. It was said that some mistakes or some terrible things that happened even in Moscow, for example, the Nordos hostage taken in 2002, when the whole theater was taken by Chechens, and as a result of storming carried out by FSB troops, 130 people were killed and only 5 at the hands of terrorists. And the idea was that the FSB was so weakened in the 1990s because of democratic reforms that now they need support and not criticism. And after every terrorist attack, we hear the same thing, the same words, that we need to give more powers to FSB. We need to make the state in Russia more strong to prevent terrorists to try to pressure the decision makers. And in 2006, even the very definition of terrorism was changed. The new law was approved, the law on prevention of terrorism. And in this law, the definition of terrorism is that it's an activity of terrorists who try to pressure the decision makers. So it's not about awful acts against civilians. It's mostly about decision makers and how to prevent terrorists to pressure decision makers. Well, and you see that in many cases, for example, in case of suicide bombings, of course there is no pressure to decision makers because these people, they mostly never try to request or to send requests to the authorities. Well, there is no threat to political stability, so it's not terrorism. And this position became very useful for the security services. And I remember only one example in 2004 when Basayev's militants invaded for 2 days the whole region of Ingushetia, when the FSB generals were punished because the whole region was lost for central authorities for 2 days. Well, but it was only one example. For any other terrorist attacks, well, it's not terrorism.
So to summarize, you're making a very clear distinction, I think, between in the Nordost siege, the victims were, the losers were the public. I mean, the victims were the public. And so there was no need from the FSB point of view or the Kremlin point of view for anybody to be punished. Whereas in the Ingushetia raid, the FSB was directly damaged, and the heads had to roll following that, and they did roll, didn't they? Quite a lot of them.
Yes, few generals even in central apparatus, and all generals who were responsible for counterterrorism in the region. Also, it was a quite big thing because they never witnessed the same things before and after that with the FSB. Mostly they are completely, there is no criticism announced claimed by the Kremlin towards FSB generals.
In addition, your critique points very clearly to the fact that the FSB was not competent to deal with these crises because it was still enthralled to the past.
Yeah.
Could you explain?
One of the biggest problems with the FSB's approach to terrorism, and specifically in the North Caucasus, that they always looked for foreigners, for outsiders. They said that, well, maybe Western intelligence services are complicit and we should prevent them to go to the North Caucasus, and as a result, human rights organizations, for example, Human Trust, was expelled from Chechnya, or Peace Corps, again, was expelled from Chechnya. Or, for example, they said after 9/11 that maybe it's Al-Qaeda and we have a common front against Al-Qaeda, and in this case, not Chechens, but Arabs and Al-Qaeda responsible for the crisis. And it was miscalculation because the main terrorist tactics, for example, hostage takings, were invented by Shamil Basayev, who was Chechen, and using of female in suicide bombings was again invented by Shamil Basayev 2 years before it was first witnessed in Jerusalem. But as a result, because there are many accusations and allegations against foreign intelligence services, FSB almost failed to cooperate with Western intelligence services. You know that we had once common joint counter-terrorism group, British and Russian, but it was disbanded some years ago, and there were some documents signed by FSB director and FBI director, but as far as we see, there is no cooperation. Even worse, we had a very good cooperation with Georgian secret services, especially in the early 2000s, and Georgians were very helpful to extradite to Russia some terrorists who carry out the biggest and the most disastrous terrorist attacks in Moscow. I mean, 1999 Moscow apartment bombings. But the problem is that because of change of political regime in Georgia, and Saakashvili became Georgian president, these relations with Georgian secret services they just ceased. We have no cooperation with Georgians. Well, we keep some good relations with Belarusians, but you know that now we have a big crisis, so maybe to the problem with them.
Yes. There's another very striking example that you examine of the FSB being, again, enthralled to the past when it comes to the lessons that were drawn from the Orange Revolution, for instance, and the consequences for FSB activities thereafter within Russia. I'm thinking about the campaign against NGOs and so on.
But you know that some groups, some opposition groups and some NGOs were targeted, and there is a special documentary, I think, documentary of Mamontov on Russian TV, where the most prominent human rights organizations in Russia were accused of cooperating with the British, and specifically British intelligence. And of course it was quite strange and not very effective decision, because Putin then was and still is very popular politician, and there was no threat from these small and not very significant groups to political regime and to stability of Russia, and to accuse them, well, it looks like just a miscalculation of threat.
Yep, I would agree. The analysis you make of the way the FSB has taken over whole new areas of e-surveillance and indeed activity in Russia's near abroad, the post-Soviet space, all lends one to suspect that you feel that maybe the FSB is now no longer controllable even by the Kremlin. Is this true?
Yes, it's really true, because we used to compare the FSB with old KGB, but there is a big difference, because the KGB was all party control. There was a communist cell in every division, section, and of the KGB. But the FSB is absolutely independent entity, and there is no parliamentary control of any kind of society control over the FSB, and sometimes the FSB uncontrollable even by the Kremlin, and you see that the FSB very high corrupted organization, and these things are not supported by Kremlin, but they have nothing to do with the FSB, because there is no system of control.
And we know that sometimes Putin, when he was a president, he used very peculiar methods to try to obtain control over the FSB. When, for example, he asked another security service, anti-drug agency, to investigate the crimes committed by FSB leadership. And as a result, a general of anti-drug agency was sent to jail. So the FSB clearly won his struggle, and Putin had no maybe ability, maybe no will to do something with this situation.
So if you were trying to plan a positive way forward, if you were trying to be optimistic, what would your how would you see a possible way back into controlling this monster?
Well, when party control disappeared in the early 1990s, the decision of Yeltsin was to create a kind of feudal rivalry inside the intelligence community. And there was a constant struggles between different secret services. They competed with each other, and as a result, Yeltsin had an impression that he might be independent. He might compare, for example, the report of the FSB director with the report of communication agency director. Well, he might be in the know. But in fact, this strange idea was clearly failed, and I think it was quite predictable, because the FSB started to win this game even before Putin became prominent. And so I don't think that it's a good way to reform or to have the secret services under control. Well, I think what Yeltsin done, it was very, and in this case it was very effective, and maybe it was one of the decisions, is that he tried to clearly divide the areas of responsibility. For example, the FSB was responsible only for counterintelligence and counterterrorism. The FSB even then was named not FSB, where B means security, безопасность, very wide term, but K, counterintelligence, контрразведка. But what happened in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, FSB now responsible not only to operate inside country, not only for counterintelligence and for counterterrorism, but for protection of the constitutions, wide term, for operating abroad, because they have now department responsible for foreign intelligence. Well, and it looks like this idea of dividing the area of responsibility failed, but I think it was one of the decisions. And of course, we need.
You think it was one of the?
It was a decision how to make the secret services under control.
You mean it could have worked?
It could, yeah. No, I think it worked in the early mid-1990s.
Right.
It worked because, for example, foreign intelligence service, SVR, because they had nothing to do inside the country, when this service was more under control of the Kremlin, and FSB, because they had no rights to operate abroad when, in the mid-1990s, again, they were more controllable, they were more under control of the Kremlin, but it was maybe in 1996, 1995.
But do I deduce from that that you see the only possibility of regaining control in that direction of redividing up?
Redividing the area of responsibility and, of course, public and parliamentary control. But, of course, it's impossible to do because it's not a question of security services. We might create a very great, big Committee of Security and State Duma, and in fact we have the Committee of Security and State Duma, but it's completely useless because, first of all, the chief of this committee is a former Deputy Minister of Interior. He is very, very involved in security services affairs. He is not independent. Well, so we need to change the whole society to do something with the secret services.
For example, this man who's the chief of this committee told me that he can't control security services in Russia and can't even require them because he had no access to the state secrets. And other members of parliament don't have any access to state secrets, so it's impossible to control the Russian secret services.
But he never tried to obtain this access. He never tried to change this situation. He's happy with it.
This is the approach.
This is a rather gloomy answer to my question. It's time that you had a chance to ask some questions. I'm now given us enough kind of an introduction. Ellen Darendorf, perhaps you could say your names so that...
Well, you've said it, Ellen Darendorf, and like you, Susan, I remember the old Soviet Union, and I'm even older than you are. And so my question is, my question is how you got the idea of setting up the website, of writing the book, because I think of you as so young and a whole different Russia. We rejoiced at 1989. We thought that it would be life transforming, and now there's an enormous disappointment about where Russia's at, not only here in the West, I mean among the Russians who were involved in 1989, but where did you get the idea of working on this, and how isolated are you, or do you have a wider circle of friends and colleagues that you can talk to?
The second part of questions.
Yeah,
yes, of course.
and
We
also the first.
are isolated in a very high extent.
Yeah, that's...
And there is a feel of abandoned living in Russia and being an investigative journalist right now. And the main problem is that the authorities now pay attention to your investigation, and you have the possibilities to affect on things, on any events.
And
Sorry,
other journalists not very...
Just to be clear what you're saying, could you say that again? Because
and it's very difficult to understand that as journalist you have no possibility to affect on anything in Russia and to change any and have an effect on any events in Russia,
and
because authorities and society have no attention to your investigations. It's about the second part of question.
And the first part, well, we started to work as journalists quite simultaneously in 1996, and when we worked for newspaper Сегодня, financed by Vladimir Gusinsky, and it was a kind of, I thought that it was, and I think now, it was professional newspaper daily, and when we tried to create maybe something, to write something similar to the New York Times. It was big ambition, of course, but it was the idea. But by then I worked for business department, so I worked something about computers and internet, and got to be very bored, maybe 2 years. It's a good way to go abroad because these companies can pay for your visas. But to be frank, it's not very interesting to see another printer or another, I don't know, software. Well, but by 1998, I started to write about secret services because then it was a period when FSB and communication agencies started to struggle under the control of information security market. So it was the first step for me. For Irina, it's another story.
For me, it's what was easier because I worked for investigative department and criminal department of the paper, and I used to have such type of situation and feel really interested in law enforcement agencies, any type of crimes and secret services.
Oh, so
from the beginning.
By 1999, no, not by 1999, by 2000, we decided that, well, it's security services became more and more prominent, and they would play a more important role in Russian future. It was clear because the Second Chechen War just started. Putin became Russian first director of the FSB when he was appointed as the chief of chairman of Security Council. When it was clear he would be successor of Yeltsin, so it was quite clear that the FSB and other security services would be very, very important. So because it was just a hot topic, we decided to create this website. And firstly, we were inspired by the idea of the website of FAS. It's an American website of Federation of American Scientists. They have very good secrecy project, and they challenge every day American government to get more information, more classified information, to publish it and to collect it website. The problem for us, of course, was that there was no possibility to challenge authority because we then had no Freedom of Information Act, and there is no way to obtain these documents in the way that American colleagues can do. So it was created as a journalist project to collect all information available about the secret services, because you know the FSB is not based only in Moscow. We have a big regional structure in every regions and towns where are branches. So we tried to collect information from even local papers, because some local prominent FSB people quite suddenly might be appointed, I don't know, deputy director of the FSB, and you need to understand their backgrounds. That's why that was the idea.
Thank you. Oliver.
I'm Oliver Bullough. I'd just first like to...
Who is a writer who has written a book about Chechnya and the Caucasus?
And written for Susan's website. I'd first like to congratulate you on your book, which I was lucky to get a review copy of. I think it's brilliant.
Thank you.
I think many people here, British people who've been to Russia, are probably used to the response, so you're British, you must be a spy. I'm just wondering if you had ever picked up any clues for why the British Secret Services have such an amazing reputation in Russia, and why they think all British people are spies.
Well, to be frank, the answer is that, first of all, Jan Fleming was always very popular in Russia, and and another problem is that Soviet secret services and Russian secret services they love to talk about their former successes, and the biggest success for Soviet intelligence was Kim Philby, and still is. Well, so all these things about George Blake and Cambridge 5, it's so important for the foreign intelligence even today, and because there are some limits. For example, you can ask Department of Foreign Intelligence responsible for history of the foreign intelligence about some things that happened, but there is a limit. You can't ask about anything that happened after 1961. I don't know why, but that decision was made 10, maybe 12 years ago, but still it's the same date, 1961. That's why Kim Philby is still very popular. But there is a second maybe answer to the question, is the situation in the North Caucasus. The problem is that still for Russian authorities, the Great Game is a big deal. And last year, one of the prominent pro-loyal Russian journalists even created a special documentary called Continuation of the Great Game. And in this case, it's about Afghanistan, how the British are involved, and they try to undermine our sphere of influence in the Central Asia and all these things. So, Great Game is still alive in the hearts of some people. Maybe that's the answer.
Hello.
Just tell us who you are.
I'm Jill Nichols. I'm a documentary maker. I was wondering if you have an idea of how your situation compares with dissidents in the Soviet era, and whether I'm afraid I don't know whether you're working still as journalists, whether you're in danger yourselves, and whether it's more that Russia is like a sort of velvet prison like Hungary in those days, or whether you're in direct danger as you would have been in the Soviet era if you said things like this.
No, for sure we cannot compare the situation. Of course, Soviet Union is not Russia, and we have no. Now it's not totalitarian state.
Yeah, you can see we are here.
We are here. We can.
And we are free.
I hope we can go abroad. We have passports. We can go abroad. We can get back to Moscow, and we can walk. We can publish what we can find. Now the secret services they are much more selective than KGB used to be, because the activity of the KGB and the KGB was very intrusive in the life of average Soviet citizen. You have to deal, if you want to get foreign passport to go abroad, you have to deal with KGB people, and so it's always was you can feel their presence. For the FSB is much more selective. They target only those who might pose some threat, some potential troublemakers, some politically active people, and because we now have very few people who are really interested to challenge authorities or to ask questions or just to raise questions, that's why it's a completely different situation. Well, that's why we can't compare our situation with the dissidents. Of course, it's we were heroes. Just.
My name's Andrzej Swidlicki. I work for Polish news agency. I wonder whether you have any idea how active the FSB is in former Moscow, the former Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, for instance, and would FSB be involved in investigation concerning the circumstances of air crash that Polish president was killed in April this year, or would this be left to prosecutor authority?
I think, of course, the FSB officers might be involved in this investigation, because, you know, in such serious cases, there was a investigation group that consists from representatives of different ministries, including the FSB operatives.
That's possible.
It's possible, but it's not a sign that the FSB can change anything in these investigations. It's really not the case. This is.
But if you're talking about areas where the FSB can operate, this department that I mentioned, it is responsible for collecting information abroad and to act abroad inside the FSB. When this department was established in the late 1990s, and we still have no clear dates because it was secret then. Then, firstly, it was tasked to deal mostly on the territory of the former Soviet Union, and mostly to prevent future Orange revolutions. But the problem is that because it's so secretive, it's very different. And the idea was, firstly, to divide the area of responsibility for SVR, foreign intelligence, to operate in Poland, in the West, and in the Eastern Europe, and the United States, and for FSB to operate only in the territory of the former Soviet Union, including Baltia. But then things started to change, and now officially it's impossible to obtain information where with limits for the FSB. But very recently, this department.
Sorry, officially it's possible.
It's impossible. It's impossible to obtain information where the limits of area of responsibility for the FSB department responsible for foreign intelligence. But the problem is that quite recently, this department, because every department in the FSB, they have their own insignia, and it's very remarkable. Because you can sometimes see with insignia, you can understand, you can guess what might be the area of responsibility for this particular department. And in case of this department, they adopted the globe as a symbol. Well, now, if you look at the insignia of foreign intelligence, we have the same globe. So maybe now we have no such, the FSB has no such limits, but we can only guess.
The gentleman with the red jersey.
Because of the color.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Youssef. And do you see any connection between the actual FSB, as you describe it, and the so-called Russian mafia, being good mafia and bad mafia? Is there any link? Do they work together?
Because FSB was corrupted even in the mid-90s, when we have when the Russian mafia was very influential. So the FSB was penetrated by, and some of the FSB officers were very corrupt and they cooperated with mafia. But the problem is that now this situation changed, and not because FSB became more pure and they purged their ranks of corrupt officers. The problem is that economic situation changed. In the 90s, we have mafia not because we loved it, just because businessmen, new Russian businessmen, they needed someone to solve their problems, their disputes among with each other. So you need someone to go and to say, well, we have this guy steal my money. Maybe we can arrange some dispute, because there was no judge and law enforcement agency was completely ignorant and helpless. Mafia played this role, kind of arbiter for business. But today, law enforcement agencies they became stronger. So you don't need, if you are a Russian businessman living in Moscow, you don't need to go to mafia to ask to solve some problem. You can go to law enforcement agencies. They can solve your problem. You can pay them. They can solve the problem. So if we are talking about this kind of corruption, well, FSB is a part of it. But if we are talking about gangs that were very active in the 1990s, I think that the situation changed.
Because the FSB have a right to investigate economic crimes, so they have a possibility for corruption.
They can open case against you, for example, because they may suspect something.
May I ask in Russian?
You may, and
May I ask in Russian?
you may please tell us who you are first.
I am a Russian, right? Скажите, пожалуйста, вот когда вы говорите о том, что Кремль утратил или не утратил контроль над ФСБ, как понимать...
This is a question about the Kremlin's control over the FSB.
Как понимать слово «Кремль»? Имеете ли вы в виду президента Медведева в течение последних 2 лет? Или и президента, и правительства? И можем ли мы предполагать, что Путин, став президентом, придя на этот пост с поста председателя ФСБ, каким-то образом утратил контроль над этой организацией?
What do you mean by the Kremlin? If we're saying that the Kremlin has lost control, what do you mean by the Kremlin? Is it the president and the government?
The government of administration.
Can it really be true that Putin has lost control? I mean, can you unpack this lot?
Now, I think we have to tell not only about Putin and about Medvedev. I think we have to talk specifically about the Kremlin as administration of president, for example, as a government, because all of them have no tools, no mechanism to control the FSB. Because when you have a very large structure, you need something to be done systematically, and something like outside control. For example, they tried to create a kind of prosecutor control, but because the prosecutor office has no right to ask for secret documents from the FSB, well, they're completely they cannot produce real investigations and to understand the situation inside. I can say that some years ago there were some rumors in Moscow that Putin adopted a very strange habit of trying to get informal information from the FSB. He used to have meeting every week with some FSB generals to ask them about some questions. But the question for me is, okay, you can ask these guys. First of all, I can't understand how to check their loyalty. Another problem is for me how these generals you invited to this meeting, how can they check the loyalty of their subordinates? And because you have so many levels inside the FSB, and you have regional departments and regional branch, how you can understand that all these people would be loyal to this small group of generals who might be governed by Putin every week? I think it's just in bureaucratic terms, it's completely, there is no use in this system.
So, Am I right in saying that you're saying your response to the question makes it even worse, because you're saying that the FSB isn't even in control of itself?
One example, you know that in the case of Anna Politkovskaya murder, we have a lieutenant colonel of the FSB, Pavel Yagzov, who was suspected to provide information about her whereabouts to killers. And there was an investigation, and we then worked for Novaya Gazeta, and we checked this information independently, so it's not only the line of official investigation. But this person acted not because he was ordered by his leadership, but because he was bribed by someone outside the service. And even for the leadership of Moscow department of the FSB, the problem was that they were completely surprised by the activity of Ragozov. So and we are talking only about this particular regional branch of the FSB. And then the central apparatus of the FSB, then the Kremlin, you see so many levels, and there is no system of obtaining information from the low level to the top.
То есть вертикали власти нет.
No.
So there is there's this phrase, the vertical of power, and the gentleman is saying basically that doesn't work either.
Because there is no accountability, there is no transparency, so you cannot order them to do something. Well, if they produce you some reasons not to do it, you cannot check this information, because again, you have no independent media, you have no parliamentary control, and you have no prosecutor control. You cannot check why they decided not to execute a decision.
I'm James Thacker. I was involved in human rights issues in the 70s and 80s in Russia.
James Thacker was involved in human rights issues in Russia in the 70s and 80s.
When Anna Politkovskaya was sitting in the chair as you were, there was still quite a lot of conjecture and a sort of hall of mirrors sense as to what the politics of Russia was emerging to be. Zhirinovsky was still around. Do we need to know what the political ingredients of the FSB are? Do you know what they are?
Excuse me, can you repeat the question?
Do you know what the political ingredients, the ideological ingredients of the FSB is?
It's very difficult to define the ideology of the FSB now, because they are not united, and they have now one strong idea about themselves. But some of them view on themselves as a heiress to the Tsar Akhranka. It's
secret police
the secret police of the Tsars, and at the same time they see on themselves as a heiress to the old Cheka police, secret police, and
police, yeah.
It's difficult to combine all these things.
At the same time, some of them, if you are talking about generals, they are strict Orthodox and they support Orthodox Church. And you know that there is an example of 5 Catholic priests were expelled by FSB when the Orthodox Church felt that their positions in Russia might be undermined by Catholic proselytism. But at the same time, especially in regions, you can see, if you talk with FSB officers, that mysticism became very, very prominent. For example, there are some ideas, there's a concept called dead water, мертвая вода in Russian. And the idea is that we, Slavs, were enslaved by Jewish Christian civilization many years ago, and now we have to release ourselves from this influence of Jewish Christian civilization. And of course, this is against Russian Orthodox Church. But these things you can find even in St. Petersburg regional department. And if you check at YouTube, you can find the lectures of these people given to St. Petersburg FSB department. So you see that if we are talking about low level, where mysticism is very popular. If we are talking about generals, because they like to talk about themselves as Orthodox. So it's a very strange, a complicated mixture of very strange ideas about the future and Russia and what's going on abroad. Maybe the only one idea that they share all, I think it's the idea that Russia is surrounded by enemies. So it's maybe
It seems to me that the analysis of somebody like Alexander Etkind, who coined a wonderful phrase, hauntology, to describe Russia at the moment as, quite unlike the West, where we no longer know about our past, as haunted by its past, but haunted by different aspects of its past, not by one single past. So different parts of the community, different levels of the community are haunted by their own particular piece and that seems to me to be a framework within which what you're saying makes...
Yeah, because it's allowed people to think that Russia is unique, and because Russia is so unique, we are surrounded by enemies. And you know that some Russian prominent experts loyal to the Kremlin started to say, well, you, Europe, you lost your Christianity because you are post-Christian society. We are still Christian, so that's why we are kind of hope for the world. But these kinds of ideas are quite popular.
My name is Mary Macaulay. Could you say something about the relations between the FSB and the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Internal Affairs? Because in many societies, in fact, important checks upon the security services are operated by those institutions because they hate the security services. And it has been said to me by American specialists that when they have been at meetings where different representatives from the Siloviki are present, it's quite clear that they all gang up against the FSB because they hate the FSB worst of all, and that is apparently quite similar to the United States.
To be fair, I don't think so, because the actual Minister of Internal Affairs in Russia, Rashid Nurgaliyev, is the FSB general. And FSB officers were sent to Interior Ministry in 2003 and afterwards to occupy key positions, and they still are there. And and maybe you remember that many years Sergei Ivanov, who is a close friend of Putin, he's from the KGB, he was Russian Minister of Defense. So I don't believe that now Interior Ministry can present a kind of challenge for the FSB, especially because inside the FSB there is a special department called Department M from the word militia, responsible for penetrating the Interior Ministry and to control the Interior Ministry. For the Defense Ministry, the situation might be more complicated because it's a huge organization and there is a part military intelligence which is responsible for intelligence, and they are more independent. But in fact, I don't believe that they might pose any challenge again because they never tried to do it.
Masha Khan, you.
I was rather surprised by you saying that there's no efficient mechanism within the system of FSB, either from top to bottom or from bottom to the top. How can the FSB then be so powerful if there's no mechanism? That's my first question. And the second question, I'd like to ask you about your take on the new law about the FSB and the extending of FSB powers, allowing the FSB to warn people about their potential offences and all that. So how does all this come together?
If we're talking about power of the FSB, well, we have to talk about power of the FSB inside the country, and because we almost lost our civil society, there is no independent media, so there is nobody to challenge the FSB, to ask questions, to criticize them, and the FSB was granted a kind of regime of immunity by the Kremlin. Well, that's why they are so powerful. Another problem is that, you know, that in the early 2000s, many officers of the FSB were given key positions not only inside the FSB but in state apparatus and state corporations. And we have now a lot of FSB, former FSB, or sometimes actual FSB, nobody knows exactly because it might be secret, in biggest Russian corporations. And they managed to change it's a very political culture of Russia, and now it's became more suspicious and more secretive. And now, if you're a journalist, it's almost impossible to ask questions and to anticipate response from official. And another problem is that if you ask question, so you would be asked by official in turn who paid you for the question and who ordered you ask this question. And this is a big problem, and this happened because of the FSB. That's why they are powerful inside the country. But if we are talking about their activity abroad or their activity in the North Caucasus, I don't think we can say that they are so powerful. For example, in the North Caucasus, they used the power not to change the situation there, but to avoid responsibility for the crisis. We had counter-terrorism operation in Chechnya for 10 years. It started in 1999, it ended in April 2009. And the FSB was responsible for the crisis only 31 months, in 2001, 2003.
I didn't quite understand that. The FSB
was responsible for the crisis only for 31 months. 2001 months, yeah, 2001, 2003. Then the responsibility, the control were handed over to the Interior Ministry. The FSB just didn't want to be responsible, and now they are not responsible for what's going on in the North Caucasus. They might use their death squads or shoot and kill policy, but they are not responsible. Someone else is responsible. Ramzan Kadyrov is responsible, or internal troops responsible, Khloponin maybe, but not the FSB.
And the law.
Law. The law, to be frank, we think, and there is a special chapter in our book, for Medvedev, the battle against extremism is a very big issue. For him, it's maybe the biggest threat to political stability and the biggest challenge for the political regime in Russia. But he is not so obsessed with the FSB as Putin used to be. That's why he given the role of the main actor in this battle against extremism, not to the FSB, but to the Interior Ministry. And the special department responsible for fighting against extremism was created inside the Interior Ministry. And they were very active now, and they are fully supported by the Kremlin. And I think that the FSB just understood some months ago that, wow, it's a big threat for Medvedev, and they're so inactive, they're so passive. We need to show their loyalty, their readiness to help, to save the country again. And well, and they started to pressure Medvedev for this new law on preventive measures. But in fact, the same preventive measures were given to the Interior Ministry 2 years ago. So we had this situation not for 2 months, but for 2 years.
George Carey, filmmaker.
Hi. You said that the civil society had more or less disappeared in the sense of people who will challenge this. And yet, it seems, is this because people want stability that they think the present government provides, and they want the measure of prosperity that seems to have come with it? And in other words, have the Russian people themselves, I'm talking not individually, but in terms of the majority, acquiesced in the increased power of the FSB, do you think?
I think it's not only because of stability, but because of prosperity. I think, and we think, it's a kind of deal between the middle classes and the Kremlin. So middle classes were given private freedoms, and in turn they forgot about the public freedoms. And I think both parts clearly understood this deal. And if you talk now with businessmen in Russia, they are not very interested in politics. They don't want to take part in manifestations or demonstrations in Russia and Moscow, for example. And it's very difficult. We have friends among lawyers or businessmen, and it's almost impossible to convince them to go with us to some manifestation, especially if it's about some abstract things, like, for example, freedom of expression. If, for example, it's a manifestation because Markelov was killed, prominent Russian law, yes, you might expect some lawyers who might attend these manifestations. But if we are talking about some abstract things, freedom, well, it's too abstract. And I think it's a big lesson for us. We fought in the early 1990s that people wanted freedom more than prosperity, but really they needed luxury cars, mansions, property.
And so, providing they go on having their BMWs and Mercedes and things, do you think there will be any demand for more freedom? Where do you see that coming from? Or is it just part of what is unique about Russia, that nobody seems to want to be involved in politics? And I use the word nobody loosely, obviously, just in terms of majorities.
I think that we have now some signs that people became more active, but it looks like it's mostly about local communities, and mostly because of financial crisis of 2008. Some trade unions became more active. Some people, low-level businessmen, more active because, for example,
because they lost money.
Because they lost money. Or, for example, we have community of people who give money for their apartments, and they were never given no apartments, no money back. Well, they might be active. But when their demands are satisfied by authorities, they immediately stop any political activity. It never, we always hoped, and many Russian experts hoped that maybe these activities of local small groups might emerge in something bigger with some more general demand. But for today, we have no such thing.
It might be more violence in Russia because Russians have now an illegal way for demanding anything.
Yeah, and you know that some policemen were killed in Primoria. Well, that might be a sign of something, but that's all.
It's only one way for democracy. What I don't know, anybody wants this or not.
No, of course it's a violent way.
Sorry,
it's awful.
What do you mean? It's only one way. What do you mean?
We can see only rise of violent activity in Russia. That's all. But I don't think this is a way for more democracy. For democracy.
Yeah, it's just a violent
thing. You see it as likely, but not hopeful.
No, it's not hopeful, of course.
But it is likely or not likely?
It's likely.
It's like we have it now.
We already have some examples.
Yeah. Now, at the risk of seeming terribly naive, I'm still looking for a little hope. Where would you, if you're trying to chart a path of hopefulness, it's not in violent revolt. Where is it?
Well, I don't know. Maybe. Well, we had so many hopes. We hoped that if people might get more sophisticated educations, or they might travel abroad, they can see something in the West. Well, young people and people who I'm 35, and I see many I see generation after me and in the early 20s. They, to be frank, they're not very active, and they're quite depressed that all key positions in society and business, state apparatus, occupied by people who are older than them, and they're 30s and 40s, and there is no place for them. They're quite depressed. But this depression led only to their passivity, not to. They never. Today, they never tried to challenge this status quo. It looks like for us, because we are 35 and we witnessed Soviet rules and Soviet system, and now we see another rule, another system. We can understand, and our generation can understand that it might be not only one system of things. It might be 2, 3, 5. It might change. But for them, because we were born in it, for them it looks like nature, something like I don't know, established by God.
I have a couple of questions, and forgive me if they were answered at the beginning of your presentation.
Can you speak?
Sorry, I have a couple of questions.
What's your name?
Oh, sorry, Laura Griffith. I have a couple of questions, and sorry if they were answered at the beginning of your presentation because I was late. Firstly, can you comment on the extent of cooperation between the FSB and other intelligence services in different countries? And secondly, another foreign relations question. Given the challenges you've outlined in terms of the prospects for democracy, what can outside actors do, if at all, and what should they do strategically if they want to help either civil society or, for example, the EU, other states? And lastly, the ability for terrorists to strike in Moscow and within Russia. Can you sort of say a bit more about that? Why can't they be prevented? Does that threaten the situation and the perception of the FSB?
Well, the first question about cooperation, we answered it. The problem is that we now almost have no cooperation with Western intelligence services. The FSB has cooperations only with Central Asian secret services, and this cooperation is very strange. FSB allowed Central Asian and first Uzbek secret services to operate on the territory of Russia, to hunt down so-called extremists or terrorists, or sometimes opponents to the regime of Karimov, to extradite them, or sometimes just to kidnap them. And it happens because we now have this Shanghai Cooperation Organization and special RATS, so-called Regional Anti-Terrorist Structure. And there's a special rules that the members of this organization might use the secret services on the soil of the member states. And because there is not Chechens, for example, in China, Chechens never tried to hide in Uzbekistan, so Uzbeks and Chinese secret services started to use this opportunity to operate on the territory of Russia. And the second question was?
Oh, yes, what can outsiders do, if anything, to help the situation?
Well, I think it's a question not to us, because we are journalists. We try to investigate secret services. I have no answers to these questions, because we have so many attempts. It's even some papers were financed by foundations in Chechnya, and we have some disappointing examples. These papers were closed down because the editor decided to be co-opted by local authorities. Well, I just don't know. I think it's a big question, and we have no answer today. And the last question, there was a third question.
Sorry, there wasn't a question. I was just asking about the fact that terrorists can strike, it seems, with such frequency within...
I think that was partly... well, okay. Read the book.
That's good. That's good.
I've got one very concrete question, which interests me, which is about the... you write very interestingly in the book about the deliberate cultivation of the myth of Andropov.
Yeah.
And I think the West, to a certain extent, bought this myth that there was this precursor to Gorbachev who, if he hadn't died, would have executed this plan of perestroika, which would have come from the inside and been clear and firm, and it would all have been very different. Mm-hmm. You don't actually say in the book whether this was a complete myth or not. You talk about Andropov's nasty past and his pursuit of dissidents and so on, but was there in the man this intelligent economist who was thinking about radical reform, or is this...
Oh, well, first of all, I don't think... The problem is that Andropov, even as a chairman of the KGB, was completely incompetent. Well, you know that he started his career in Karelia, and he was, by the uprising in Hungary, he was a very, very important person in Russian embassy, in Soviet embassy in Hungary. Well, you know how the Soviet Union responded to this uprising. When he was in charge, when the Czechoslovakia crisis happened, again, he was in charge, and you know the response. I don't think it was very effective, especially if you're talking about the reputation of the Soviet Union. When he was appointed and he became Soviet leader, again, all that he might invent, it was, well, we have to strengthen so-called labor discipline. We have to catch people in the streets, and for example, in 2 o'clock, because in this time they all should be on the walk. Well, I think it was completely stupid, and I remember my parents, for example, my father is a physicist, and he is a 3 days as a physicist, so he could work at home. But at this time, he was forced to hide because he might be just caught in the streets, because he might be suspected to flee from his workplace. And I think it was completely an effective way, and he was a brutal, and the director of one of the shop in Moscow, one of the biggest shop in Moscow, was shot. Was executed by the KGB, but we see, okay, you killed these people. Did it happen? Did it help to fight corruption in the Soviet Union? No, it was never effective. So I don't think that if he would alive, he might propose any real decisions. And another problem, it's a habit of the KGB. If to create a personal image. Okay, these guys with glasses, well, if he wore glasses, he might be intelligent, and we can say, well, he loves some poets, so he might be intelligent. For me, to be frank, I can't understand. It's enough to be intelligent? Why we decide that he was intelligent? That's
fine.
He drank whiskey as well.
Yes, he drank whiskey, yeah. So that's why he was intelligent.
And a rider to that question, I mean, and again, a question about myth-making and propaganda. You write wonderfully in the book about the string of television serials and movies that have been made about the secret services over the last 10 years or so. And one thing you don't really say is how effective you think those have been. Do you think they've been a really important plank in what you were addressing in an earlier question as far as the, general acceptance of the status quo and the lack of resistance?
To be frank, we had the first attempt was in 2004. It was a movie called Личный номер, or it was named Countdown in English. And the idea was the plot of this movie was to portray 2 terrorist attacks: 1999 Moscow apartment bombings and Nordos hostage taking. But just in case of movie, the theater was replaced by circus. And the main hero was, of course, FSB officer, and the mastermind of terrorist attacks was an oligarch called Pokrovsky, living in exile in London. And to be frank, the movie was a big success, and for many, this fictional version of events replaced what's really went on, and what's happened in 2002. And well, so that's why I think these things might be very successful if you have no independent media, you have no questions raised, and you remember that at the same time when this movie was produced, some people who raised questions about 1999 apartment bombings or about Nordos hostage taking crisis, we were suppressed. One person, one activist was sent to jail, and Mikhail Trepashkin. The book with some allegations, and even these allegations were not very confirmed by evidence, but the book was confiscated. The media who raised questions about Nordos hostage taking, well, they were suppressed. It was an effect. I think it was quite effective.
Now, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Tom Oliver, and I'm just an admirer of your work. I want to ask you a counterintuitive question. At the moment in this country, there's a big debate about cutting resources to our defence infrastructure and also to our secret services. And my counterintuitive question is, quite clearly, the FSB is a very sinister and rather frightening organisation which has lots of rather complicated effects on Russian society and elsewhere. But is there a way in which the FSB is actually rather an important part of keeping the lid on really very dangerous people who are operating on the fringes of the former Soviet Union? And is it in a way quite a good thing to have a competent secret service in such an important country?
first of all, I don't think that the FSB was very effective on the territory of Soviet Union. You know that if they tried, they failed to prevent orange revolutions, and there were some examples when, for example, FSB was very active in Abkhazia, but because they decided to support the wrong candidate, they lost their positions there, and they were taken by surprise by Georgian forces completely just because they lost their positions and they chosen the wrong candidate. And sometimes we witnessed that the regimes in these countries, they used Russian secret services. For example, there was some examples when the leaders, for example, of Azerbaijan, they openly invited the chief of Russian foreign intelligence to get to his country, to Baku, to show the support of Moscow. It might be. I think it might be was very useful for Aliyev, but for the president of Azerbaijan. But I don't understand why it was useful for Russia. So it looks like sometimes these secret services they were so desperate to show their power that they are present there, so they were used by the regimes of these countries. So I don't think they were very effective there, and they're very effective today.
And a rider to that question, you don't think that they could have any role in the modernization process in Russia?
Well, the first thing in modernization, you have to provoke free discussion. We have the free sharing of opinions, and because FSB persecuted some scientists, for example, Valentin Danilov is still in prison, while as far as we know, scientific community became very fearful, and they now try to avoid so-called unapproved contacts with foreign scientists, and the same true for the researchers and for activists. Well, I think that you cannot modernize your country if you have no public and open discussion, because you have to decide which way to choose. And if there's a few people in the administration who can solve all these problems, say, well, we have to go to this direction, and there is no way to challenge this decision. Maybe they are wrong, maybe they are right, I don't know. But we have to ask questions. We have to write to ask questions.
Thank you. Now, am I going to let them free, or have you got any more questions? Another.
I have two questions. One is about increased anti-Semitic feelings and propaganda, anti-Semitism in the Soviet, in Russia. Do you see the hand of the FSB behind it? That's one question. The second question is, I haven't read your book yet, but I know that you used to work for Gushinsky, and Gushinsky belongs to the bad group of oligarchs as opposed to the good group where Abramovich is. Now, there is a big fight between the oligarchs, the wrong ones, and the Kremlin, the Siloviki. And how can I read your book without thinking that there is a bit of bias, because you work for Gushinsky and maybe you are a bit against the other side of the equation?
Okay. So, firstly, about anti-Semitism. I can say that now Jews are replaced by the people from the North Caucasus. And they are targeted on the streets, not Jews. That's now. So we can say that's well, there is some sort of anti-Semitism. It might be popular inside the FSB. They love to talk about Jewish oligarchs who control our country, all these things. But about Gushinsky, we worked for Gushinsky in 1996 till 1999. Well, it was more than 10 years ago. Another problem is that I think we have kind of.
So I don't think so that we work for Gushinsky. We work for newspaper Сегодня.
So I don't think we're all journalists.
And did a lot of journalist work. We were not a son of Gushinsky, never.
Yeah, and you can check our stories. I think you can judge it. And I don't think that all journalists of the Sunday Times were all puppets of Murdoch. I think it should be simplification. Well, another problem is that there is a big miscalculation misunderstanding that we think sometimes, and the situation is portrayed, that there is a struggle between the Kremlin, Siloviki, and oligarchs. Well, we don't think it's true. I think that the same oligarchs, in fact, in 1998, 1999, they choose the FSB as the main tool of politics. And now we have the same people, the same oligarchs that we had in the 1990s. They're still in power, and when economic crisis of 2008 happened, these oligarchs were supported by the state. They were not asked to get back their money. They were supported. They were given government resources and state resources. So I think that we still have the same economic system in Russia that we used to have in the 1990s. Just the methods were changed. Then it was media, and they struggled, and now we have law enforcement and the FSB and other secret services. It's just another manner, but the model of society, the model of economic system is the same.
On that cheerful note, I'm going to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your candor and your pessimism and your time.
Thank you very much.
We're very honored.